Fellow citizens of Africa, I greet you in the name of the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League of the World. You may ask, what organization is that? It is for me to inform you that the Universal Negro Improvement Association is an organization that seeks to unite into one solid body the 400 million Negroes of the world.
Pan-Africanism, at its most basic level, is the belief that African people, both on the African continent and in the diaspora, share not merely a common history, but a common destiny. Who would have thought that a simple country boy, born almost 50 years after slavery was abolished in the British colonies, would go on to provide the most comprehensive blueprint for the liberation of his people?
Rally round the flag, rally round the red, gold, black and green. Marcus say, so Marcus say, red for the flag, flow like the river. Marcus say, so Marcus say, green for the land, Africa. Marcus say, black for the people, included from, that took us away, captivity, captivity. Required from us a song. Right now, man, say
I was born in the island of Jamaica, British West Indies, on August 17, 1887. My parents were black Negroes. My father was a man of brilliant intellect and dashing courage. He was unafraid of consequences. My mother was the direct opposite of my father. She was a sober and conscientious Christian, too soft and good for the time in which she lived, always willing to return a smile for a blow, and ever ready to bestow charity upon her enemy. Of this strange combination I was born 36 years ago, and ushered into a world of sin, the flesh, and the devil.
The black man's Messiah was born Malchus Mosiah Garvey. He would later change his name to Marcus. His mother, Sarah Garvey, wanted to name him Moses, sensing that her son would become a leader, like Moses of old. Garvey's parents had 11 children, but only he and his older sister, Indiana, lived to adulthood.
As a child, I went to school with white boys and girls like all other Negroes. I never heard the term Negro used once until I was about 14, when my little white playmate and I parted. Her parents thought the time had come to separate us and draw the color line. They sent her and another sister to Edinburgh, Scotland, and told her that she was never to write or try to get in touch with me, for I was a nigger. After my first lesson in race distinction, I never thought of playing with white girls anymore, even if they might be next-door neighbors. At home, my sister's company was good enough for me, and at school, I made friends with colored girls next to me. At maturity, the black and white boys separated and took different courses in life. I grew up then to see the difference between the races more and more.
The adolescent Garvey has already developed a clear-eyed understanding of the social laws that govern his world. He leaves school at the age of 14 to work as a printer's apprentice in the shop of his godfather, Alfred E. Burroughs. In 1903, a violent hurricane swept through the Jamaican countryside, destroying much of its landscape and vegetation. Sarah Garvey had lost all of her crops and became destitute. Wanting to provide more support for his mother, young Marcus decided to head to Kingston to advance his career as a printer. The nation's capital is a far cry from his rural home in St. Anne's Bay, but Garvey settles in one of the poorest sections of the city, known as Smith Village. His mother, Sarah, along with his sister, Indiana, later join him there, where they struggle to find regular employment.
So as he moves to Kingston and starts working as a printer, starts working in the writing world, he sees very clearly that his strong African features, his dark skin, will work against him unless he sort of abandons his black pride and moves up in the system to a sort of socially accepted, lighter-skinned, lighter-looking way. And Garvey fundamentally rejects that.
By the time Garvey becomes a teenager, you've got these labor patterns where Africans are going from different islands, the Windward and Leeward Islands, they're traveling around for work, for labor. So when Marcus Garvey comes into his teens, he's looking around, he's reading, of course, he's studying, and he's also gaining skills as a printer, he's writing, he's looking, and he's seeing these black people bristle against colonialism wherever they are.
There was never really a victory for British colonization here. Jamaica was always in a state of civil war between the European agenda and the African struggle for freedom. And that generated a tremendous amount of inner confidence and courage. It really produced in the Jamaican community a determination to survive and to be. And he was quintessentially a product of that.
By 1907, Marcus Garvey had risen to the ranks of master printer and foreman at the P.A. Benjamin Company. As vice president of the Printers Union, he was involved in an unsuccessful strike by his fellow workers, seeking better wages and working conditions. Garvey was fired and branded a troublemaker, further cementing his bond with the working class. Compounding this difficult period, his mother, Sarah, who envisioned her son as the Negro Moses, dies in March 1908. It is another hard milestone, pressing the young 20-year-old Garvey in his search for a future not yet within his grasp. He sought out J. Robert Love as a mentor, bringing his ambitions and questions to the fiery preacher and social reformer, who was also a masterful orator and publisher of the weekly journal, The Jamaica Advocate. In his young protege, Love found a willing disciple. At age 21, he starts his very first newspaper, which ceases publication after only 3 issues. But the power of the press has been cemented in Garvey's mind as he goes on to publish more successful newspapers. The roots of what we now refer to as Garveyism begin to emerge.
One of the things that stands out for this vision is that when Garvey traveled through Central America, right, this is before he founded the UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association, he looked around and he saw that everywhere in terms of political power, socio-economic power, people of African descent were at the bottom of the ladder. And so he asked himself this question. Either one accepted the idea that this was sort of preordained, right, the natural order of things, or one began to look at what were the historical and political conditions that led to this kind of injustice.
He discovered several things, and those things he opposed the rest of his life. Number one, he discovered the terrible conditions of the Jamaican and Caribbean workers in Limon. So he had the opportunity to see also from inside what was going on with the United Fruit Company and then see the effect on the workers outside. The reaction of the Limon elite, black elite, against him was very strong. So they were not very concerned about the terrible conditions of the workers. And those that were out in the farm, they were not so much concerned about those people.
After a brief stint in Costa Rica, Garvey travels to Panama and other Central and South American countries. The brutal working conditions of the Caribbean migrant workers, whom he tries to organize, are another rude awakening. With a world to conquer, Garvey returns to Jamaica near the end of 1911 and soon departs for England.
Marcus Garvey believed as a young man that England was the motherland. And anybody who had any ambition would come at some stage to see what they could do. So he came to England in 1912. He was in his early 20s. And he had no papers, he had no entree into society, he had no means of supporting himself, really. And he came initially and just worked on the docks. But eventually he heard that there was a new journal starting called the African Times and Orient Review, which is run by this man called Juz Muhammad Ali. He managed to get a job working for Ali, not as a journalist, not as a writer, but as a messenger, as a handyman.
The Egyptian-born black nationalist and master propagandist, Deuce Muhammad Ali, helped to sharpen Garvey's focus on black nationhood. But a certain American scholar would have the most profound influence on him.
I read Up From Slavery by Booker T. Washington, and then my doom, if I may so call it, of being a race leader dawned upon me in London. I asked, where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? Where is his president, his country, his ambassador, his army, his navy, his men of big affairs? I could not find them, and then I declare I will help to make them. I was determined that the black man would not continue to be kicked about by all the other races and nations of the world. I could not remain in London anymore. My brain was afire. There was a world of thought to conquer.
On June 17, 1914, Marcus Garvey boards the SS Trent, heading for Jamaica, alongside the only other third-class passengers on board, a West Indian missionary returning from Basutoland with his African wife.
I really never knew there was so much color prejudice in Jamaica, my own native home, until I started the work of the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Men and women as black as I, and even more so, had believed themselves white under the West Indian order of societal. I had to decide whether to place my friends and be one of the so-called black whites of Jamaica and be reasonably prosperous, or come out openly and defend and help improve and protect the integrity of the black millions and suffer. I decided to do the latter. I became a marked man, but I was determined that the work should be done.
With the help of several associates, Marcus Garvey forms the Universal Negro Improvement and Conservation Association and African Communities League, launching it on Emancipation Day, August 1st, 1914. A young Amy Ashwood, who would later become Garvey's wife, is one of the organization's first officers. Its mission of uniting all Africans worldwide is the hallmark of the philosophy that will become known as Garveyism, with Marcus Garvey as its chief creator, president, and traveling commissioner.
Here you've got a guy who comes from the stable working class and who's able to educate himself. And I've felt that this man really had an awful lot of awareness about the world in which he lived. He had informed himself, and he was able to converse on a lot of different topics.
Garvey, as a teenager, was involved in elocution contests. In the schools, the young people were taught how to articulate ideas, how to debate, and Amy Ashwood Garvey, his first wife, it was said, beat him in a debate at East Queen Street Baptist Church in around 1914. But the oratorical skills that he demonstrated were honed, developed in Jamaica as a teenager in these competitive challenges.
On King Street, you just find Sunday evening people gather. People just gather and they'll be reasoning. Out of that came a lot of pastors who developed their own church. So I think that's where he inculcated that naturally from, in an environment of oratory.
Garvey's followers were extremely loyal to him. Some critics went as far as to describe this unwavering support as fanaticism. Up, you mighty race, was a clarion call to the black man to reclaim his best self and not be left out of mainstream society.
Garvey was seeking to empower people. To me, that willingness to give, that willingness to try to benefit people all throughout the world through his knowledge and also through his ideas for projects to materialistically, economically, spiritually benefit people in a tangible way. I think people were gravitating towards the gift that he gave.
He wanted to create something in Jamaica that was a mirror image of Tuskegee because he felt that you had to have the skills, the industrial skills, of an industrialized society in order to build your own society. And that's what Booker T was doing at Tuskegee in terms of the engineers, etc., that were being trained in those types of skills.
He writes to Booker Washington in 1914 and says, you know, we need some help. I want you to help us as we're working toward this Universal Negro Improvement Association. And then gets a reply from Booker Washington saying, oh, well, if you're going to come to the United States, you're welcome. You know, we'd like to see you. Now he's thinking beyond even the Caribbean. He's thinking about the greater African world.
Marcus Garvey sets his sights on the United States as the strategic base for his global plan. Sadly, he would not get a chance to meet his hero, Booker T. Washington, who dies in November of 1915. The Negro Moses lands at the port of New York on March 23, 1916, and heads straight for the Mecca of the black world.
It's hard for me to see how, under the circumstances that were far more difficult in this country and in New York and in my beloved Harlem, how he was able to motivate and bring together so many people of color.
Marcus Messiah Garvey came and brought the African consciousness of the Roaring Twenties. And so Harlem was not a dead community. It was a community ready for rebirth. And so the New Negro and the Harlem Renaissance and all of that came at the time that Garvey was bringing this larger picture that we're connected globally.
I don't know whether it was because he was in the Caribbean, but in the early part of the 20th century, it was something that was vital to the discourse and I think the progression of ideas in the African American community.
With the help of his friend Wilfred Domingo, Garvey finds work as a printer, and he begins to speak publicly about the UNIA and its aims. He embarks on a 38-state tour promoting the organization while surveying life in America. He had intended to return shortly to Jamaica, but encouraged by the reception he received from black Americans, he decides to stay a little longer.
He was very attractive to large numbers of people. He was very bright, he was very assertive, and he's gaining this power in the black community. It's not just those West Indians, it's all kinds of black folks who are glad to hear this guy saying a lot of things that needed to be said.
When he was in Harlem, I remember my mom and dad and them talking about him and how proud they were to see this man looking like the general, you know, the major, as he walked through, and all the people that followed him and believed in him. We even bought stock. We bought that $5 stock that got him thrown in jail, okay?
In order to fully understand his place in history, imagine a world as it looked to him and many other blacks during the early part of the 20th century.
You have to think of a world in which the entire continent of Africa was under European control, with the exception of Ethiopia. You're looking at the Caribbean region, certainly English, French, Dutch, Spanish, that's under European control. So the world is largely one of white domination.
When World War I jumps off, Europe is now engaged in another struggle that draws in all these other people who are not Europeans, who were once their subjects. So when you see, for example, the British West India Regiment, all these Africans from the British Caribbean who are pulled into this conflict called World War I, and now these are soldiers who are not going to just stand by and fight for Mother Britain. No, they're fighting for their independence. Same thing in the United States. Black soldiers drafted into World War I, who then go and fight. They fight in France, they fight all over, but then they come back to the United States and they say, yeah, we're not about to just get lynched. We're gonna fight back.
World War I shattered this myth of white invincibility, but also this myth of white superiority. You know, there are lots of interviews of black soldiers who see white soldiers quivering in fear, and they begin to realize, well, no, this story, this narrative that the colonials have created about our inferiority is wrong, right? So when Garvey steps onto the stage with his very innovative ideas of organizing black people independently, of basically saying we must be in control of our destiny, the conditions already exist.
Marcus Garvey was the first to preach forcefully and unabashedly that black people had the right to interpret their own reality control their own destiny. His entire life was consumed with seeing subjugated Africans respected and respecting themselves. He had awoken in Black America an awareness of what slavery and oppression had taken, the concept of nationhood. At the dawn of the Harlem Renaissance, Garvey introduced the new Negro.
A black person who was no longer feeling victimized, who was remembering our history before enslavement. We saw it, in the Harlem Renaissance, where through creativity, through the verbal arts, through, the music, black people were again affirming that there was a new feeling of power. That is what the new Negro was about.
By the middle part of the 1910s, you see Africans from the Caribbean, you see Africans migrating to New York from the South, you see Africans coming into urban centers, whether it be Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia, places like that, Boston, from other places. These are the new Negroes. They're not going to be satisfied simply with, we fought our way out of enslavement, we're going to get a little patch of land, and we're going to move forward. No. These new Negroes have something else going on. They're increasingly urban. They are in a space now where they are cheek to jowl on the subways or on the buses or on the sidewalks with these white people. They're not going to step off the sidewalk. They're not going to not look them in the eye. And so the new Negro, right, the pride they feel really is captured in a wonderful phrase you see in some of the signs by the time you get to the first major convention, August 1920. You see signs that say, the new Negro knows no fear.
Not everyone was enamored with Marcus Garvey's message of black pride. In the United States, especially those who pursued an integrationist agenda, argued that his movement was both racist and reactionary, and that he didn't speak for black Americans.
I think that one of the things that we have in the United States is that we consistently have black people trying to figure out how do we get free. And we have lots of different strategies. I think that part of the criticism is born out of a sense in the black community that we don't have a lot of cushion. And so I think that part of what you're seeing in that is a fear that as Garvey is really catching on, that it may not work. It may not work. And then where are we?
Anytime a black man stands up and speaks what I like to say, truth to power, people always, the larger masses of Americans always see him as a megalomaniac. That's the same thing they said about Malcolm. That's the same thing they said about anybody who becomes empowered. That's the same thing they said about H. Rap Brown, the same thing they said about Stokely, the Panthers. Anytime you won't turn the other cheek or you won't lay down and say, I'm going to be nonviolent, you're considered a radical. You're considered a megalomaniac.
I can't tell you how many people accuse President Obama of being racist. All you have to do is turn on Fox News. People accuse Martin Luther King of being racist. If you think some of these people who are really focused on integration and peace and harmony were racist, then obviously you're going to have the same conclusion about Marcus Garvey and anyone else who you don't like.
The ideology of black empowerment took a foothold in thousands of communities throughout the world. Between 1916 and 1927, the period that marked the high point of Garvey's leadership, he would lead the largest mass movement of black people in history. The geographic breadth and scope of the movement remain unparalleled, almost unfathomable today. In 1919, Garvey establishes its official headquarters on West 135th Street in Harlem. 3 blocks up on West 138th Street, he conducts weekly meetings and other important events at an extensive one-story structure whose name is inspired by Liberty Hall in Dublin, Ireland. Garveyites identify the Irish subjugation under the British as a mirror of the suffering of black people worldwide. UNIA leadership encourages all of its branches to buy their own property and establish a Liberty Hall of their own.
The organization, under my presidency, grew by leaps and bounds. By my writings and speeches, we were able to build up a large organization of over 2 million by June 1919, at which time we launched the program of the Black Star Line. We succeeded, however, in making the Universal Negro Improvement Association so formidable in 1919 that we encountered more trouble from our political brethren. They saw the influence of Edwin P. Kilroy, at that time an assistant district attorney for the city of New York. On the complaint of the Negro politicians, he started to investigate us and the association. During my many tilts with Mr. Kilroy, the question of the Black Star Line was discussed. He did not want us to have a line of ships. I told him that even as there was a White Star Line, we would have, irrespective of his wishes, a Black Star Line.
Flying home on the Black Star Line. Flying home on the Black Star Line.
Even as the organization came under sharper scrutiny, the UNIA-ACL launches several business ventures, such as the Negro Factories Corporation, Black Cross Nurses, and famously, a steamship venture known as the Black Star Line, which would transport cargoes of African produce to the United States. On a cold day in October of 1919, several thousand supporters gathered at the 135th Street Pier in Manhattan to watch the SS Yarmouth, one of the ships of the Black Star Line, set sail on the Hudson River. It was not only New Yorkers who took notice. Onlookers in ports throughout the Caribbean and Central America marveled as the ship arrived. Thousands more read about the incredible Black Star Line in the Negro world. In this dramatic fashion, the ships raised the international profile of Marcus Garvey and his movement. Sadly, even though the beleaguered ships of the Black Star Line were found to be seaworthy, they would suffer gross mechanical failures, causing heavy financial losses.
One of the rumors is that the many FBI agents who infiltrated the UNIA sabotaged the Black Star Line, and there's some documentation of some things that seem to suggest that they indeed were doing that. Remember, the first FBI agents, the first black FBI agents ever hired in the history of the United States were hired to infiltrate Marcus Garvey's organization.
The fact that we had a White Star Line and that our people could have a Black Star Line, it meant a lot for the people. If you considered how many times this thing failed and the people put up the money again and put the money again, buy another ship, Brother Garvey, buy another ship, we're going to make it.
But to me, the story of the Black Star Line is really the story of the possibilities that it inspired in the imaginations of black people. And that's something we'll never be able to trace fully. I'll never forget the day Una Mozak put in my hand a little biography that her father had written, a paperback version of it called A Star to Steer by Captain Hugh Mozak. This was the man who was the captain of Marcus Garvey's ship, the Booker Washington. So I'm looking at this book, and then Una told me the story, and then I read the story for myself, and this was the genius of the Black Star Line, and may have even contributed to its failure, but we have to ask whether it was a failure or not.
As Hugh Mozak recalls, the ship would pull into Caribbean ports laden with bananas, vegetables, and other products that were destined for New York City. But a strange thing would happen. Every time the ship was about to pull out, the captain would receive orders from the UNIA headquarters in New York to stay in port, even whilst the cargo was rotting.
Black people had begun to come down to the port and see something they'd never seen before. See a ship full of black people with a black captain doing business. Now, if you read the newspaper accounts or the critiques of Garveyism, what they're saying to people is, oh, Garvey, they were bad business people, they couldn't deliver their cargo. But Garvey's directive was, these black people have to see the possibilities of what we can do.
I have been deprived of the opportunity of properly explaining my work to the white people of America through the prejudice worked up against me by jealous and wicked members of my own race. We are fighting for the founding of a Negro nation in Africa so that there will be no clash between black and white, and that each race will have a separate existence and civilization all its own without courting suspicion and hatred or eyeing each other with jealousy and rivalry within the borders of the same country.
Amy Ashwood arrives in Harlem from Panama in October 1918 and reunites with Garvey. The following month, she's appointed General Secretary of the growing organization, giving her the opportunity to be right by Garvey's side. 1 year later, the leader survives an assassination attempt in his Harlem office. Multiple shots from a .38 caliber pistol find their mark. But Amy Ashwood and another officer shield Garvey from further gunshots. The would-be assassin, a black Harlemite named George Tyler, makes good on his escape, but is apprehended by a passing patrolman who takes him into custody. Before committing suicide several days later, Tyler confesses that he was hired to kill Garvey. Marcus Garvey's legend grows, having survived an assassin's bullet. He marries Amy Ashwood on Christmas Day at Liberty Hall in Harlem. But their union quickly deteriorates, lasting only 3 months. Citing irreconcilable differences, Garvey files for divorce in early 1920. Garvey's second wife, also named Amy, like many, was attracted to his message and his impressive oratorical skills. She heard him speak for the first time at Liberty Hall in Harlem in the summer of 1919. She joins the growing organization, eventually assuming the role as personal secretary to Marcus Garvey. The two would marry 3 years later in 1922, after Garvey's divorce from Amy Ashwood was finalized. Amy Jakes Garvey would go on to play a pivotal role in the movement and advance the teaching of Garveyism long after her husband's death. Denied full participation in society, blacks increasingly looked to Garvey for workable solutions. The first international convention of the Negro peoples of the world responds to the clamor for change. The unprecedented convention took place over the entire month of August 1920 in New York City. At its first mass meeting, held at Madison Square Garden on August 1st, Marcus Garvey addressed a record crowd that would later proclaim him Provisional President of Africa.
25,000 people coming together from Africa, from the Caribbean, Europe, Latin America, to discuss the conditions facing black people throughout the world. And they came up with this important declaration. And the declaration shows the complications of the black situation. But there was a commonality. The commonality is that racial oppression was common to blacks wherever they were.
What we saw was a rise of incredible violence against black people, because black people weren't having Jim Crow. Black people were fighting for their rights, and the response was a lynching. On average, African Americans were lynched 1 every other day for 3 decades, because it was going to take that level of violence to try to get the black community to back off their demands for their full citizenship rights. So you've got this narrative that in America, if you work hard, if you do what you're supposed to do, if you build your economic basis, you too can have the American dream. I mean, we saw this in Tulsa in 1921 with Black Wall Street, where you had a black community that was thriving. And all that did was to anger the whites in Tulsa. Then a false charge of rape against a young black man, and then the next thing you know, as the photos talk about running the Negroes out of Tulsa, you have ethnic cleansing.
It's amazing how we've never been able to bring that coalition of people together that are prepared to say, I'm black, I'm proud, you going to Africa, count me in. Yeah, wow. And do it in Madison Square Garden. And have everyone there say, let's go. And to listen to J. Hoover said, you know, this shit's serious. You know, these black folks, they think they're somebody. They think they're Americans. If they start thinking like that, we in a hell of a lot of trouble.
The name of Garvey had become known as a leader of his race. Such fame among Negroes was too much for other race leaders and politicians to tolerate. My downfall was planned by my enemies. They laid all kinds of traps for me. They scattered their spies among the employees of the Black Star Line and the Universal Negro Improvement Association.
In January 1922, opponents of Garvey had reasons to celebrate, as he and 3 officers from the Black Star Line Shipping Company were arrested and charged with mail fraud.
I think it was unjust to focus on Garvey's organization, and it was clearly politically motivated by J. Edgar Hoover. We have documents where he's written. Unfortunately, we've not found a way yet to put Garvey in jail or deport him. Why don't you look into a mail fraud claim, for example?
One of the things they tried was the denial of visa. When he traveled to Jamaica and the Caribbean in 1921, Hoover had advised that he shouldn't be allowed to re-enter, but that was overruled, and he was returned to the United States.
The targeting of Garvey, also the trumped-up charges, it's sad to say the state sees our potential, even a lot of times when a lot of our own people don't see the potential. African people cannot have a conversation without acknowledging the counterinsurgency, the attack on our movements, attacks on our people. We're told to believe that the FBI was this entity that's going to mafioso and all that. No, J. Edgar Hoover denied that the mafia even existed. His whole career was built, off the attack of Garvey.
While awaiting trial during the summer of 1922, as groups like the NAACP devote resources to anti-lynching legislations, Garvey makes a very bold move. On June 22nd, in Atlanta, Georgia, he meets with the acting imperial wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, Edward Young Clark. When word of the meeting gets out, Garvey's detractors sharpen their attacks. Some of his most powerful enemies in the black community, led by former supporter A. Philip Randolph, organize a Garvey Must Go campaign to pressure the authorities to expel him from America.
The Universal Negro Improvement Association has been misrepresented by my enemies. They have tried to make it appear that we are hostile to other races. This is absolutely false. We believe that the black people should have a country of their own, where they should be given the fullest opportunity to develop politically, socially, and industrially. It is because of this belief, no doubt, that my Negro enemies so as to prejudice me further in the opinion of the public, wickedly state that I'm a member of the Ku Klux Klan, even though I am a black man.
Remember, Marcus Garvey comes to the United States the year after Birth of a Nation emerges as a film in the United States, a film that romanticizes the time when the Klan rode high, a film that was screened at the White House by Woodrow Wilson, who says, alas, it is all true. It is like history written with lightning. So when Marcus Garvey comes in and says, okay, I can look at the president who's being disingenuous. I could look at these white liberals, so to speak, who are our friends. Or I could talk to these guys in these white sheets who are friends with these other guys who in their same clubs, in their same political formations, bank at the same place, who say, we don't like niggers. It's okay, good. So if I talk to you, and we come to an agreement on everything from race mixing to where we won't cross the line. And if we make a deal, I can firmly then say that as their representatives, I have a deal with the rest of them.
That's a hell of a way to look at it. I hope that's not true. I understood why he was making those alliances because he wanted to physically go back to Africa, reestablish a country there, build industry there, have a prosperity that was rooted in the black community that they could control. And when he met the KKK, he found people who also agreed that it would be great if all the black people would leave America.
It was, I think, a bold move and a commendable move to find white people with whom he could be partners, to work together to achieve some kind of amicable separation. I think that there is nothing wrong with that.
You don't make a deal with the devil. You just, yes, you know, so the Klan does not even believe in the humanity of black people. It seems like they're talking about the same thing, but they're not. Because what Garvey is doing is he's recognizing the humanity of black people. You are not going to hear the Klan talking about black is beautiful. In fact, they think black is everything that needs to be destroyed.
Repatriation. And I suffer in a Babylon too long. Africa for the Africans. Marcus Mosiah Garvey said that. Back to Africa.
In 1920, Marcus Garvey unveiled his famous Back to Africa program, which encourages blacks living abroad to return to the motherland. He would later argue that the concept of repatriation he introduced was grossly misunderstood, and he stressed that it was never a central part of his program.
Now, fortunately, people who are supporters of Garvey who don't have a complete understanding can themselves get caught up in the idea of back to Africa being what Garveyism represents.
He wanted us to return to who we are, to maintain our African identity, to respect our African civilization, and therefore returning to source was not just physical, it was intellectual.
Garvey himself said that we don't want all Negroes going back to Africa. Some are no good here and will be no good over there either. But it's important for us to understand that the concept of an African empire was central to Garvey's thinking.
Marcus Garvey say, him say up, 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 the mighty race, come together black people and take your place.
The UNIA embarked on a plan to repatriate blacks in the Americas. Liberia, which was set up in 1822 by the American Colonization Society, was the intended geographical location for this venture. UNIA delegations visited Liberia on multiple occasions to negotiate the establishment of a UNIA community in that country. But their plans went awry, as land promised to them was instead leased to the Firestone Rubber Company.
So Firestone was going to have to not be able to enter into this lucrative contract if the UNIA was able to establish a system whereby the men who returned to Liberia would have been given so many acres of land, crops, tools to run their own farms. Of course, then they wouldn't have been able to tap rubber for little or nothing.
Well, the Liberian experiment didn't work out for a lot of reasons. One, when Americans had gone to Liberia, they just took on the attitudes and behaviors of their own oppressors. But then there was the whole economic issue when, you know, there was opportunity for white corporations in America to make a tremendous amount of money from the country. They weren't just going to allow Marcus Garvey to go in and take advantage of that opportunity.
The truth is, they were very much influenced by what the U.S. had to say. And Garvey never foresaw that. So that's where the Liberia project fell flat on its face. Now, we can say this in hindsight. If he made a stronger link with Haile Selassie in Ethiopia, it would be very likely, almost given, that he would have been able to have established a settlement of blacks there, because Haile Selassie, even before his crown, Emperor of Ethiopia, was recruiting black people as well as other people to Ethiopia to make it a stronger nation.
Leading up to Garvey's trial on mail fraud, the name-calling continued to be fired off like missiles. His sworn enemy, W.E.B. Du Bois, called him a short, black, ugly man with intelligent eyes. In the January 1923 edition of The Messenger, a monthly magazine co-founded by A. Philip Randolph, there was an editorial cartoon with Marcus Garvey's head on the body of a donkey that labeled him a supreme Negro Jamaican jackass. Marcus Garvey was unfazed.
Du Bois felt Garvey was stealing all his ammunition, stealing all his thunder, stealing all his rhetoric, stealing all of his ideas. And that's what I really think was going on with Du Bois. Because Du Bois had been saying some of this stuff, and see, along comes this little guy from Jamaica, and he starts saying the same things. And this Du Bois is a tremendous egotist.
I had to conduct my own case in court because of the peculiar position in which I found myself. I had millions of friends and a large number of enemies. I wanted a colored attorney to handle my case, but there was none I could trust.
To represent yourself, in an American court, that's just not the wisest decision. We don't know what the outcome would have been had he been represented by an attorney like the others that were part of the case. To be charged with mail fraud along with others and be the only one convicted, says a lot about the fear that the American government had of Marcus Garvey, more so, than them thinking he was a criminal.
My personal conviction is you can't have a fair trial in Jim Crow United States of America of a black radical before an all-white jury. I think that's inherently unfair. That's not a jury of his peers.
What bothers me is when all these educated people can't figure out what a 5-year-old child already sees. If he didn't take that envelope, lick the glue on it, and mail it out, well, what did he do? The secretary in the office is the one who did it. Nobody's looking into that.
The piece of testimony that turned the tide, if you will, was testimony from someone named Benny Dancy, who testified that Garvey had been someone who helped to mail this empty envelope that supposedly proved that he was in on this scheme to defraud.
The evidence as constructed, I have looked at some of that myself, and one can see that this was skillfully constructed, skillfully edited from a point of view of achieving the result that they wanted.
The case of the United States versus Marcus Garvey, based on a flyer that they did not have in an envelope addressed to a man who did not even know Marcus Garvey, and Marcus Garvey did not know personally. There's no doubt that it was a setup, that it was a conspiracy led by J. Edgar Hoover. The same practices that he initiated with Marcus Garvey were the practices he perfected against the Black Panther Party and the Black Power era. It was called COINTELPRO. That didn't start in the 60s. It was created to take down Marcus Garvey.
After a 4-week trial that ended on June 18th, 1923, Marcus Garvey was convicted on 1 count of mail fraud, while his 3 co-defendants were released and absolved of all charges. Garvey was sentenced to a maximum of 5 years in prison and fined $1,000. The court refused to allow bail, but instead granted Garvey a stay of execution pending an appeal. Marcus Garvey was held at the Tombs in New York without bail for 3 months. After an unsuccessful appeal, he is once again taken into custody and transported to the Atlanta Federal Penitentiary to begin serving his 5-year sentence. On the very first night of incarceration, he pens a hopeful message for his millions of followers.
I am delighted to inform you that your humble servant is as happy in suffering for you and our cause as is possible under the circumstances of being viciously outraged by a group of plotters who have connived to do their worst to humiliate you through me in the fight for real emancipation and African redemption. All I have given to you. I have sacrificed my home and my loving wife for you. I entrust her to your charge to protect and defend her in my absence. She has suffered and sacrificed with me for you. Therefore, please do not desert her at this dismal hour when she stands alone.
So even from within the jail in the Atlanta Penitentiary, his words cut through. But obviously, the forces that led the movement, Garvey Must Go movement, didn't stop when he went to jail. They tried to diminish him even more. And Garvey's problem was that he couldn't remain in America. That provided him with his greatest platform to disseminate his truths. And once that was taken away from him, the movement was going to shrivel, and it did shrivel.
If I die in Atlanta, my work shall then only begin. But I shall live in the physical or spiritual to see the day of Africa's glory. When I am dead, wrap the mantle of the red, black, and green around me.
Garvey's conviction was challenged by many people, including some of his own enemies. Thousands of people wrote letters of support to the United States government, pressing for his release. Garvey himself applied to President Coolidge to have his sentence commuted. The position of the Justice Department was that Garvey was a menace. After serving less than 3 years in prison, Garvey's 5-year sentence is commuted by President Calvin Coolidge. Upon his release, he is immediately deported to his native Jamaica. On December 2, 1927, a large group of disappointed supporters gather at the port in New Orleans, Louisiana, to bid farewell to Garvey as he begins his journey to Jamaica. He is not allowed to leave the ship, the SS Saramacca, but delivers an impassioned speech to his supporters. Garvey's America experiment had come to an inglorious end. Eight days later, Marcus Garvey arrives in Kingston, Jamaica, where thousands of supporters welcome home their native son. From Victoria Pier, Marcus Garvey's motorcade slowly drives through a dense crowd of admirers heading towards Liberty Hall. Once there, he makes his way up to the roof of his car and gives a brief but electrifying speech. The following night at the Ward Theater, a relentless Garvey delivers a full speech to his fellow Jamaicans and lays out his plans for the future.
For 10 years, I've made my platform in the United States of America, where I made millions of friends. I shall make a similar platform in England, in France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Belgium. And one day I shall grace the floors of the League of Nations, and I shall say, gentlemen, gentlemen, we 400 million Negroes shall be heard.
While tending to his growing family, for the next 8 years, Marcus Garvey turns his attention to the constitutional rights of black Jamaicans. He forms the country's first modern political party and launches several more newspapers, with his detractors trying to derail him at every turn.
The Gleaner newspaper, they had articles warning the nation and saying to them, we hear that the Honorable Marcus Garvey has been deported. I hope he doesn't think that those antics that he carried on in America, that he can bring it here. He was badly treated in Jamaica. As you know, he was tried for contempt of court when he was launching the People's Political Party at Crossroads. And he was emphasizing that in Jamaica there was one law for the rich and one law for the poor. And for that, he was tried and charged for contempt of court, found guilty, and sentenced to imprisonment over Spanish Town.
The start of the 1930s ushered in a world that had changed significantly since Marcus Garvey's heyday. Black American actor Paul Robeson was forging a new movement. Ethiopia's emperor, Haile Selassie I, was the most famous black man in the world. And in his own backyard, Garvey had to contend with the growing Rastafari movement.
We remember at that time, Garvey was the leading black leader globally. Hands down. Everybody knows that. The emergence of Selassie put that into question. So we have a group of Garveyites saying Selassie is God, right? And therefore stands above Garvey.
Interestingly enough, although I should say Marcus Garvey didn't see Haile Selassie as divine, but he importantly lays the bedrock for Rastafari, the Rastafari movement, the fight against oppression, the fight for African liberation. These objectives of the Rastafari movement are ones that Garvey himself embraced.
To the flourishing Rastafari movement in Jamaica, the crowning of Emperor Haile Selassie I in 1930 was the fulfillment of a prophecy by Marcus Garvey, who implored his followers many years earlier to look to Africa, where a black king would be crowned. He shall be the Redeemer.
Those Africans in Jamaica who saw the necessity to rise up saw in Garvey's comments a true direction in which to look. This was to Africa, to Ethiopia, and there was the emperor bearing the proper titles: King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering land of the tribe of Judah, elect of God, defender of the faith.
He realized that black people, African people, were spiritual in general. His belief was firm that black people need to see God in their own image. So this was where he practiced a refined form of Ethiopianism. He said that black people must come to see God through the spectacles of Ethiopia, because he argued other races saw God in their own image, so why don't you come to see God in your own image?
While Garvey's efforts on behalf of the working class deepened in Jamaica, financial setbacks caused him to lose his printing press, the UNIA headquarters at Edelweiss Park, and his family home. Garvey decides to migrate once again in an effort to rebuild the influence of his fledgling organization. Without his wife and 2 infant sons, he set sail for England.
His mission was to awaken the consciousness of black people who were resigned to their role that they were given to play, and who were getting nowhere. But he was heartbroken. His own people had not accepted him sufficiently, and he had to fight in court the way that that normal people wouldn't have to do. And as a result of that, he got heartbroken and he left.
There are people in London who thought that he was very, very old-fashioned, but also he was wedded to capitalist ideals, when actually the black man, in order to get any improvement, should wed himself to socialist ideals. So he found himself in conflict with people like George Padmore and C.L.R. James. And in fact, when Garvey gave his speeches at Speaker's Corner here in London, C.L.R. James and George Padmore would turn up and heckle him. But Garvey's biggest mistake when it came to it in London was that he criticized Emperor Haile Selassie. In 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia. Selassie fought back, but the odds against him were overwhelming. There was mustard gas, tons of munitions thrown against the Ethiopian armies, and Selassie had to flee.
He felt despondent because, you know, Italy was occupying that one beacon of sovereignty that existed in the black world. And his thing was, why don't you just stay and fight for what you can, you know? Admittedly, with the help of the British troops, alongside Ethiopian forces, they were able to drive the Italians out and reclaim Ethiopia, and Ethiopia becomes fully sovereign again. If Garvey had lived till 1941, if he had lived to see that, I think his opinion of Haile Selassie would have changed.
Despite financial setbacks and deteriorating health, during the last years of his life, Garvey presses forward, his vision more precious than ever. His wife, Amy Jakes, and their 2 sons join him in England in 1937. And as soon as they settle in, he's on the road again, on a lecture and fundraising tour in Canada and the Caribbean. In Toronto, he inaugurated the School of African Philosophy to train future leaders of the movement. Wherever the orator went, he had an eager audience. In the eastern Canadian province of Nova Scotia, Garvey found particularly fertile ground as he shared his ideals of empowerment with the Caribbean immigrant community. Garvey refused to lay all the blame on the white population for the black person's lot in life. The problem of black oppression can only be solved by looking inward, he told his followers. On his last night in Canada, October 1st, 1937, Marcus Garvey gave a monumental speech that would leave a lasting impression.
We are going to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, because whilst others might free the body, none but ourselves can free the mind.
Very powerful words. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Everyone has negative thoughts, I think, and that's, you know, his statement can be understood by many people and help uplift many people.
When him tell me, say, emancipate myself, I free my mind, mentally, physically, and spiritually. I'm not bounded or limited to anything or anyone in this earth. I can rise and achieve anything I want to do. Nothing can stop I.
I mean, it's self-explanatory when you say those words, but it's really meaning that you really got to take yourself in charge. Let's face it, throughout the slave trade and colonialism, there's been the tricking of the mind, you know, trinkets and beads to sell you ideals, and the monies that are given to world leaders that are in Africa and are, you know, kept to suppress the people, things like that. For once, we realize that it's the mindset and the togetherness where all the minds are linked as one.
What he was getting at is, let us not be stuck in the past or what people define us as, but let us recognize our own ability to determine our destiny.
What made Marcus Garvey so special, he was a man that spoke from the heart. There was no backdoor to him.
Despite his failing health, Garvey returns to England, energized from his travels abroad. He rents a home for his family not too far from the UNIA headquarters in West London. But the reunion is cut short after his eldest son, Marcus Jr., falls seriously ill. The family returned to Jamaica in August of 1938, while Garvey is away at the 8th International Convention in Toronto.
He wasn't happy because we were leaving him, and my brother was ill. He had rheumatoid arthritis. The weather obviously was a problem, and we were advised by the doctors to move to a warmer climate, which would be here in Jamaica. He didn't want to be separated from the family. He was somewhat reluctant also from the point of view that he would not be able to protect us.
With his family thousands of miles away in Jamaica, Marcus Garvey was feeling more isolated than ever in London. The adoring crowds that greeted him at Speaker's Corner had dissipated by the end of 1939, and he suffered from recurring bouts of pneumonia and bronchitis, made worse by London's notoriously damp climate. There was one single bright spot for Garvey, however. In March of 1940, he was informed that Marcus Jr. had made a full recovery. His wife, Amy Jakes, sent a photograph of the two boys to Garvey that would have a profound effect on him. He knew his time on earth was short. The black man's Messiah felt the weight of all his years and what he would be leaving behind.
He was living in a drafty house in West London. And in May 1940, Marcus Garvey was presented with a newspaper and a headline which he knew could not be true. And the headline was, Marcus Garvey dies in London. Prior to that, in January that year, Marcus Garvey had a stroke. By the way, the first obituary was written by George Padmore for the Chicago Defender, because George Padmore had heard a rumor that Garvey had died. What that first obituary did was it released other obituaries, and they were all damning. They were saying the same thing, that Garvey was a charlatan, a buffoon, a disgrace to the race. And after reading all of these damning obituaries, Marcus Garvey suffered a heart attack and died. His obituaries killed him.
Marcus Mosiah Garvey, the man who delivered the most comprehensive blueprint for the liberation of his people, died on June 10th, 1940, at the age of 52. All around the world, his millions of followers held memorials and celebrations in his honor.
My whole world at 17 was exploded when he died. And I was going to make sure that it didn't die, his words. When you get to 94, you've been here quite a while. And yet you find it's not long enough. But there are many kinds of people I've met along the way. They look at me as scant as that weird woman, but I receive a good dose of respect. And it's funny, it's all about Garvey.
Marcus Garvey's brand of Pan-Africanism did not die with him in his cold and damp apartment in London. His philosophies and teachings have impacted many social and political movements around the world, from the civil rights movement in the United States to the independence and nationalistic struggles in Africa and the Caribbean.
What I have seen and what I have observed is the deep crossover between those early members of the Nation of Islam who were also had one time been members, of course, of the UNIA-ACL, which of course include Louise and Earl Little, the parents of Malcolm X, who were involved in the division in Omaha, Nebraska. And you know, these are Garveyites. We see Malcolm with Garvey's fire, with Garvey's focus on Africa, with Garvey's Pan-Africanism. And if anything, he is an intellectual son of Marcus Garvey. We see that in Malcolm X.
For someone to come along who was beautiful, heavily melanated, and have exhibited such pride and everything that was contradictory to what we have been told for so long, there was an attraction, not only for my father, but for so many, for so many people who, did not feel inferior and who was sick and tired of being subjugated, oppressed, traumatized, and so forth.
In 1965, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. credited Garvey with laying the foundation for the civil rights movement in the United States. He put it this way: Marcus Garvey was the first man of color in the history of the United States to give millions of Negroes a sense of dignity, to feel that he was somebody.
I could not find words to better express the contribution that Marcus Garvey has made. And I would not want to go back to that era to find out.
For someone who sacrificed so much, it's great that his legacy is still alive. I think it would have been really sad and really tragic if his work and his ideology, everything died with him.
Brother Bob read Marcus Garvey, as did Burning Spear, as did so many of these great Jamaican Rastafarian singers. So they kept his flame alive. And I think, even if we don't go to the books, we hear Marcus Garvey alive in the music of Jamaica.
While we might have turned up our noses at the idea of having Marcus Garvey as a philosopher in our midst, the reggae artist has to be given credit, those who took it on themselves to espouse Garvey's philosophy, using music that we could remember, in songs that we could sing and dance to, and to making Marcus Garvey become a household name.
As artists, we are custodians of the oral history and the culture. So, for as long as Marcus Garvey's teaching and philosophy is relevant, the people of the culture and the music have to somehow keep recording it.
If it wasn't for the Rastaman, you wouldn't hear about Garvey again, especially with the musicians. A man like Burning Spear, like every other song that him sing mentioned Marcus Garvey, when it was not popular to sing about Marcus Garvey. And it is that fueling up the flame, help to generate interest in Marcus Garvey.
power of Garvey's message is not diminished by the controversy surrounding it during his lifetime, and even to this day. From his black nationalist agenda to his views on racial purity, his philosophy will be the food of intellectual formation for movements, generations to come.
His sense of racial purity was that he accepted that white nationalism exists, that white people were proud of their heritage, their ancestry, and he equally was proud of his.
I think that race is clearly a biological phenomenon. It's not some sort of sociological optical illusion. It's a real thing. And it's also an important part of individual and group identity. I'm also what I would call a white advocate, in that I believe that whites, like people of all other races, have legitimate interests, and it is important and vital for them to defend those interests.
So we were living in America where it was promoted that blacks and whites shouldn't go together. So it's a common system here. So Marcus Garvey was just endorsing what they were endorsing. Mr. Garvey wasn't doing it to hate anybody, but he realized that if everybody was making the call for their people and nobody was making the call for black people, then it was his job. It is our job to make the call for our people.
Although decades have passed since Garvey's death, calls for his exoneration have not ceased. Many had hoped that the nation's first African-American president, Barack Obama, would have wiped out Marcus Garvey's criminal conviction.
You know, we certainly expected it to happen because all the evidence was there. He did not issue the posthumous pardon, and he did not give a reason. We had people who, called him up to the last minute, and the response, as far as I could interpret it, was simply that it was not going to be done.
I don't think we should ask for the expungement. Let it be a forever, let that conviction forever be a monument to show that this is what was done to him, but in spite of that, the movement still lives on. Don't ask for the expungement. Let it serve to shame those who did it.
One can say that when the oppressors seek to denigrate the legacies and the contributions of your own heroes, that maybe you should ignore them and move on. But the fact is that we're all living in a broad world, we're all citizens of the world, and we should confront all injustices wherever they are, not only who they affect. We should just confront injustices as a matter of course, and this injustice has to be removed.
Marcus Garvey was vital to the progression of black activism, not only in his native Jamaica and the rest of the Caribbean, but also around the world. He especially had an outsized influence in Black America, where the cries for racial justice and equality continue to echo to this very day.
We stand on the shoulders of Marcus Garvey, young activists, young millennials like myself, people who now have the opportunity, the privilege to sit in spaces where 50, 60 years ago were places where Marcus Garvey would have never been welcome.
We deserve to have the same opportunities as everyone else. We deserve to have the same chances. We deserve the ability to teach our children, to educate our children, and then when they're educated, for them to get work so that they can prosper.
He was a man who stood up and said, listen, we need to be empowered. We need to hold our heads high. And if need be, we need to go back to our homeland, And you should not be fearful of wanting to go back to the continent of Africa, because that's where we're all from. That's where our DNA is from.
Marcus Garvey's philosophy, which academic people popularize as calling Garveyism, has been the most grounded socio-political, socio-economic philosophy that would have guided not only our African people in the English-speaking Caribbean, but everywhere that Marcus Garvey went in Central and South America. These ideas resonated with the people.
Kwame Nkrumah wrote in his autobiography that of all the literature he read, the book that has had the most influence on him was the philosophy and opinions, Marcus Garvey. And I think I can understand why Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, as we call him here, I can understand why he was very, very inspired and moved, and where he got some of his ideas, not just for Ghana's national liberation and Africa's unification, but even for nation building.
He has always been associated with the rise of the black community out of bondage and the movement into public democracy, into the official institutions of societies. But his contribution was much further, far beyond, in fact, the struggles of the black community to come into the mainstream of public life. Garvey was involved in the European issues, he was involved in Asia. Wherever there was fundamental injustice, Garvey was a part of that ongoing attempt to make the 20th century the democratic moment in history.
So Marcus Garvey's ideas were unifying and empowering. And of course, the whole idea of African unity, I think, also stemmed up from that rallying call. You are rallying Africans all over the world. I mean, what is more powerful than that?
You know we were the greatest, even through all the ages.
The world's foremost Pan-Africanist, and in some eyes, the greatest civil rights leader of the 20th century, dedicated his life to the project of redeeming Africa.
So when Garvey talks about the redemption of Africa, why does it have to be redeemed? It has to be redeemed because there has been this long period of subjugation, this long period of being degraded and humiliated in world history. And that is the feeling that is felt by someone who has lived outside of Africa as an African and had to feel that directly. When you're looking around for redemption narratives, there aren't very many redemption narratives, if any, that involve African people.
For so long, there was this misinformation about our identity. There was misinformation about the continent, about the birth of civilization, about the significant contributions that Africans and the diaspora made.
It was up against the grain of what they thought about the African and what they were trying to get us to think our roots was a man with a spear and conch head and argyle socks somewhere in Africa worshiping Tarzan. It's not the case.
It's important to keep focused. It's important to know that we've come from a history and a background that really surpassed those that enslaved us, colonized us, and have us as consumers. And if we don't grab hold of that mindset, we're going to forever keep sinking in that cesspool, quicksand.
If you ask people in the village in which I live, does Africa have a history? They'd laugh at you. And if they said yes, it would be about the Europeans being there. At one level, I wish Garvey was back here campaigning, saying, look, we have a history, we're as good as you. In fact, we were way ahead of you.
From the outset of his campaign, Marcus Garvey attracted some powerful enemies. Yet many, including his most vocal adversary, W.E.B. Du Bois, would come to appreciate his message later on in life. How ironic that Du Bois would spend his final years in Africa, eventually being laid to rest in Ghana. Yet Garvey was never allowed to set foot on that continent.
Everyone knows from his story that he was up against a lot. You know, the moment it was understood that what he was doing was going to influence, as it rightly did, so many Africans, you know, then the war began. The war against him really began. Even though he didn't come here physically, I think he's here in many ways. The colors of our flag, the black star. I mean, most African countries have taken these same colors.
Can you imagine that his feet never touched the ground? But wherever he is as an ancestor, I know he's clapping and beating that tambourine because thousands of us, thousands upon thousands, could be millions of us, have lived his dream.
My mother used to say to me, every day you get up and you talk about going to Africa, when are you going to go?
But today, I am here. I've been here 16 years now. So just like Marcus Garvey said that he will come in the whirlwind, he will bring in spirits from the west in the whirlwind. So he's here. As long as I am here, my children are here, the eyes here, and other ones are here. The Honorable Marcus Garvey is in Africa today.
After Marcus Garvey's death in 1940, his remains could not be immediately shipped to his native Jamaica due to the ongoing World War. He was laid to rest in the catacombs at St. Mary's Catholic Cemetery in London. Through the initiative of Edward Seaga, the Jamaican Minister of Development and Welfare, and members of Garvey's inner circle, Marcus Garvey's remains were transported to Jamaica on November 10, 1964, almost 25 years after his death. His remains lay in state for 5 days at Holy Trinity Cathedral in Kingston, where thousands came to pay their respects. He was hailed by millions as the Negro Moses, Marcus Mosiah Garvey, whose entire life was consumed on the altar of African redemption, was laid to rest at National Heroes Park in Kingston, Jamaica. A fitting farewell for a man who would occupy a most sacred space in the pantheon of great Pan-Africanists.
Look for me in a whirlwind or a storm. Look for me all around you. For with God's grace, I shall come back with countless millions of black men and women who have died in America, those who have died in the West Indies, and those who have died in Africa to aid you in the fight for liberty, freedom, and life.
Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.
Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.
Up, ye mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.
Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.
Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will.
Up, you mighty race. You can accomplish what you will.